Well, let's jump into 1 Samuel 17, battle with the Philistines. Here, I got a video clip for you.
Perhaps we should have our war tomorrow when you're better rested. I should have you whipped for your impudence.
Perhaps you should fight him.
Achilles. Achilles. Look at the men's faces. You can save hundreds of them. You can end this war with a swing of your sword. Let them go home to their wives.
Imagine a king who fights his own battles. Wouldn't that be a sight?
Of all the warlords loved by the gods, I hate him the most.
Sorry, I edited the gore out there. Sorry. Oh, there we go. That was all it was. So this is just an illustration from a fictional movie, really, of this idea of representative combat. So you send out your champion against their champion in order to save lives. So I think it's interesting too that he's like, wouldn't it be nice if the king was fighting the battle? So when we come to chapter 17, who is the tallest guy in Israel? Saul. And they send out their tall guy, and Saul's not going to go out and fight him. And some have even interpreted his request for David to wear his armor as that maybe it'll look like Saul's out there. He's wearing the royal armor. But I don't know. There's also a question of Goliath's height. In the Masoretic text, which is the traditional Hebrew text that most of what our translations are based on, Goliath's height was like 9'9", super tall, right? In the Greek translation, it says he's 6'9", 6'9", which is tall, but not as tall as the tallest players in the NBA or anything like that, right? Now, which reading is correct? There is actually a Dead Sea Scroll translation that also agrees in Hebrew that 6'9" is the height. Which reading do you like better? You can just pick which one you like. Which makes a better story? The 9'9"? Well, it makes it more gigantic. But I like the 6'9" reading because Saul's a head taller than everybody. He's got to be 6'4", 6'5". I don't know what a head measures. So he's actually not that much shorter than Goliath, but he won't go out to fight him. Kind of makes Saul look worse. But when they come down to it, trying to figure out which one is which, when it comes to differences in textual traditions, so the LXX is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and then there's a Dead Sea Scroll that also has the lower height too. There's various things at play, but when you have a disagreement between two texts, they often try and see if they can explain why one reading came about. So if there's a difficult text, a difficult reading, that difficult reading is usually to be preferred. Because the reading that makes the most sense, they suggest the scribes would make it, smooth it out, make it easier to understand. So which of these is the more difficult reading? 9'9" or 6'9"? Right, okay, so it's more difficult because it's a giant, yeah. And the other one is less difficult because it's more Maybe the Greek translation, which takes place in the post-exilic era, a few hundred years before Christ, is trying to make it sound more palatable, more realistic. Do you think? That's how some have understood it. It does. It makes Saul look quite bad because he's not going out and fighting as the tallest guy in Israel. On the other hand, maybe 9:9 is added to make it more spectacular. And 6:9 didn't seem quite as spectacular a battle. Most people go with the 9:9 because the weight of all the armor he's wearing is too heavy for someone who's 6'9", it is thought. So here it says, a champion named Goliath from Gath came out, over 9 feet tall, bronze helmet, scale armor, bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. He had bronze greaves, javelin, his spear was like a weaver's rod, its iron point weighed 600 shekels. So it's explained by most commentators this is probably too heavy for even someone who's like over 6 feet, so it would take a giant of a man to walk around with it. But anyway, it's an interesting textual variation. Of course, in history, there's been some tall people. The tallest person on modern record is Robert Wadlow. He was 8'11". This was not photoshopped. This was before Photoshop. He's obviously very tall. Suleiman Ali Nashnush is 8'1". This guy is from Canada. He was 8'3", and he was said he could pick up a horse or something like that. He used to work like in carnivals and do feats of strength. So not only was he tall, he was very strong as well. This is Sultan Kosin is 8'3", obviously a very large man. But he's a lot of them, they suffer from giantism, which they usually end up having physical disabilities. But some have been known to actually been strong. Some played on even Olympic teams and things like this. But no one as tall as Goliath, 9 foot. Chapter 17, there's some interesting stuff here to learn about David too. 8, someone want to read verse 8? Some commentators have called this, not only was his actual armor, his arsenal impressive, his rhetorical arsenal is also. And it's interesting he mentions, call Saul out, right? Servants of Saul, is there somewhat a slam on the king for not coming out himself? Of course, it doesn't say their king is there either. So let's read the next verse, 11. What happens when Saul hears this? Does this verse read kind of odd after what we read last chapter? Verse 12 is almost like an introduction. Yeah, it seems like a secondary introduction, right? Why do we have to say he's the son of Ephraim in Bethlehem, named Jesse, who had 8 sons? We already learned all that in the previous chapter. So, again, we got to keep in mind how these biblical books were composed, that they use sources, right? So, writing in the exile, the Deuteronomists who put this all together drew on previously written sources and put them together. So it makes a lot of sense that this could come from a different source than the source written in 16 that was used, right? And historians do that. They use different sources and put them together. But some people think it's odd, though, that if David's already coming to court and helping Saul, that we need another introduction. But maybe this source was written on its own originally without that backstory, so it had to introduce the reader to David. We'll come back to this question at the end of the chapter. Let's read some more, though. Okay, so now we get this reference that David was working for Saul too, but would go back and forth, right? Which kind of fits with maybe his harp playing, right? He was only needed when there was a demonic episode or whatever we're going to call that. So he was still working part-time. So maybe it is acknowledging that story. Or, of course, this still could have been written without that story as its own, but it's still representing the reality that David was not full-time in the service of Saul. Is it interesting David's brothers follow Saul even though they know David was anointed? Or maybe it's just pragmatic. He is the king. Maybe David's going to be king one day, but he's not yet. Okay, why the cheese? So he sends his son some food. Send the cheeses to the commander. Maybe he'll treat his sons well. Probably that's what's going on there, right? All right, and make sure you take these to the commander. He doesn't want his sons to be mistreated or die, of course. Did David follow the orders of his father? Well, it doesn't say he did anyway, right? He just left the stuff with someone and hurried up to the line to see the battle, right? So instead of taking the cheeses to them and to the commander and the food to their, whether this is supposed to look bad on David as much as maybe show his interest in what's going on and his concern for Israel, and maybe he is ambitious. Okay, so there's a pretty good award on the table for anyone who'd be willing to take out Goliath, right? Great wealth, marry a princess, and your family, no taxes. Sounds pretty good. David wouldn't be interested in that, though, because he's a man of God, right? But the very next verse, David asked the men standing near, what's going to be done for the person who does this? Just so we're clear. So here you get a little interesting mix of David's character. There's some ambition there. Marry a princess, I could handle that. A little bit of wealth, sounds good. But he's also, he's concerned with God's honor. Because at the same time, he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? He should defy the armies of the living God. So right away, David's first words are a mix. There's some personal ambition, but also theological perspective and his concern for God, which I think is an interesting characterization for him going forward, his first words like that. 27, it says, the people answered him the same way. So and so will be done for the man who kills him. So he's getting it on. Some say this is him getting it on the record, right? We're all agreed this is the reward here. This is what's going to happen. He brings it up again, right? And let's jump down to Eliab. Eliab. What's he say in 28? Maybe we can read 28. Okay, so what do you think of Eliab's characterization of David?
He surprised his younger brother.
He's just my little squirt younger brother. Yeah.
Well, you'd also have it's sort of a Joseph and his brother's dynamic because they saw him get anointed.
Right, yeah. He was chosen out of all of them, and he's like, oh, whatever. So usually it's thought to represent an older brother's embarrassment or jealousy of the younger brother or something like that. But some commentators have pointed out that maybe Eliab is actually being used as a signal to warn the reader something about David's heart. As a brother, maybe he does know something about David. But let's read, what's David respond? 29.
What have I done now? David replied, I was only asking a question.
I love that kind of response. It just reminds me of like sibling rivalry. And so, what have I done now? Give me a break. Just a question. But then what's he do in 30?
So David turned to someone else and asked the same thing. And the people said the same thing in reply.
So 3 times he asks about the reward. Don't tell him he's not interested in the reward. It's kind of interesting, right? So he's got this theological concerns, but he's also very pragmatic and he's ambitious, right? Right from the beginning. So the words David spoke get repeated to Saul. Saul sends for him. Well, let's read 32. It's kind of interesting, though, when David is introduced to Saul by that servant, when they need the harp player, they say, actually, he is a warrior. Right? That's how he is described. And this is exactly, he's saying, you're just a youth. This guy's been a warrior since his youth. And actually, he was described as a warrior, and he's a youth. So it's kind of interesting. He uses the same Hebrew word for youth there and warrior as he was described as. But David convinces him to let him go. He says, I've been keeping my father's sheep. If a lion or a bear comes, I go strike it, rescue the sheep from its mouth. If it turned on me, I seized it by its beard or its hair, strike it and kill it. I've killed lions and bears. This Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the Philistine. So some have pointed out that bears don't have beards. Like getting really great. So this is kind of a way of suggesting he's really talking about the Philistine. Or like it sounds like he's talking about hand-to-hand combat too, right? I'd strike it. He's really talking about hand-to-hand combat against his foes, right? Now he gives credit to the Lord. The Lord delivered me from those instances, and he'll deliver me from this. Some are suspicious whether David's making up these stories or not. But he was a shepherd. He probably had to confront wild animals, so it very well could just be something that really happened. But the way it's described is a way of describing hand-to-hand combat with a person. But how does he end up winning? Of course, it's a very famous story, right? Not hand-to-hand combat. So how do we understand that? Was this a brilliant move? Was this a deceptive move to bring the sling out? It's lunchtime. We'll come back and, and we'll cover some of that about the role of slings in ancient warfare and how this all works.